Okay, so thank you so much for joining. So I see the increase in number of attendants. So yeah, please give us the 20 seconds and we will begin soon. All right, so yeah, why don't you get started? So thanks for coming. Welcome to the SNU UC San Diego joint webinar. My name is Moonsop Lee. I'm an assistant professor at UC San Diego and director of the Korea Pacific program. So I read this series with Professor Jungmin Lee at SNU, and this series is jointly organized by Seoul National University, Department of Economics, and University of California, San Diego, School of Global Policy and Strategy. And we appreciate the generous support by the Research Foundation of the Korea and Lawrence and Shelley Clubs. So today, the title of the event is How the Superstar Firms Shaped the South Korea's Economic Miracle. So you see on the slide, the presenter, Dr. Jaedo Choi, and discussant, Professor Sura Kim. So event is for 1 hour. So we will see the presentation for 25 minutes and discussion for about 15 minutes. And we will have ample time for the Q&A. So during the presentation and discussion, if you have any questions, please leave your question anytime on the Q&A box. Again, if you have any questions, please leave those on the Q&A box at the end of the presentation and discussion, so I will deliver those questions to either presenter or discussant. So now let me introduce today's speakers. The presenter, the Dr. Jaedo Choi, is an economist at the Federal Reserve Board. He received a PhD in economics from the University of Michigan in 2022. His current research focuses on industrial policy and global technology transfer, and plus the superstar firms and economic miracle he's gonna talk about. Today, with the discussant is Professor Sura Kim. So she is an assistant professor of economics at the Pennsylvania State University. So prior to joining Penn State, she was the postdoc research associate at Princeton University for 1 year. She received her PhD in economics from the University of Maryland in 2023. She's a macroeconomist with a specific interest in firm dynamics and labor and innovation. Okay, so without further ado, so I will bring microphone to today's presenter, the Dr. Jaedo Choi. Jaedo, floor is yours.
Right, thanks Musa for the nice introduction, and thanks Jungmin and Musa again for inviting me to give the talk at the SNU and the UC San Diego joint webinar. Okay, everybody can see it? Yep, this paper is titled This paper is titled Superstar Supervillains, Large Firms in the South Korean Growth Miracle. Joint work with Angel Repchenko in Michigan, Dmitry Ruzik and INSEAD, and Young Shim at the IMF. I think Young Shim also joined as attendance here, and also use the user disclaimer here. So let me start with the motivating figure. Give me a second. Yep. So the left figure is South Korea's real GDP per capita in 2010 US dollars. And since 1970s to 2010, South Korea's regional GDP per capita increased more than 10 times. It's well known as South Korea's growth miracle, which has been the of people's interest for a very long time. And people have tried to understand what was the driving factor behind this South Korea's growth miracle. In this paper, we document a very novel fact on firm concentration. We find that while South Korea's growth miracle period, we also find that South Korea's firm concentration also dramatically increased. So the right-hand side panel is computed as follows. So we're going to sum the top 3 firm sales within each sector and divide it by total manufacturing gross output. We have about 10 broad sectors, so we have about 30 firms to compute the figure here. So this is the sum of top 30 firms total sales divided by manufacturing gross output. Initially, around in the mid early 1970s, it was around 10% But in the end of the 2000, in the end of the sample period, 2010, it increased to 30%. During these 40 years of the data, we observed about 200% increases in this firm concentration ratio measure. So today we want to understand what is the role of these large firms in South Korea's economic performance. As economists, I also want to know the South Korea's large firms' performance on the economic outcome. But also this is going to be important, especially in the South Korean context, because we're having a lot of political debate on the role of large firms, and so also known as the chaebols, as also political science as well. So depending on the causes of this firm concentration, these large firms can be either superstars or supervillains. Superstar means that they have positive impact on the economy. The supervillains means that they might have the negative impact on the economy. So for example, if this firm concentration was driven by productivity or export demand growth of these large firms, they would more likely to have positive impact. But if these firms, the concentration were driven mostly by distortions, such as some favorable subsidies or tax or political connections with the government, then this firm concentration may have negative impact on the economy. So also we will be interested in also the consequences of this firm concentration, like market power, welfare, or real GDP. So another purpose or object of this paper is trying to give some numbers regarding the consequences of this firm concentration increase. So in this paper, so they're going to propose a growth accounting framework based on the small open and the heterogeneous firms model. So firms are heterogeneous along 4 dimensions. Firms have different productivity level, and firms have different export demand. So some firms might export more compared to other firms. Also, they're going to subject to some distortion, labor and capital distortion in particular. You're also going to allow for the firms' market power in the product market. They're going to have oligopolistic market power in the product market, but also the oligopolistic market power in the labor market. We drive 3 key analytical results. So first is inversion. What does it mean in economic field is that we can establish one-to-one mapping. So one-to-one mapping between the model and the data. So by exactly fitting the data, we can infer like firm model exogenous shock directly. The second is that we can decompose concentration, which I showed in the previous slide, into the 3 components: productivity, trade, or entry and exit margin. So in particular, the top 3 firms, exceptionally large productivity growth or export performances, or there might be some dynamism, entry and exit into these top 3 firms list. Those dynamic entry and exit components will be captured by the 3rd component. We also show that the shocks that increase the concentration can increase or decrease the sector DFP depending on the initial distortion. So this is the second best word. So even seemingly positive shock, like productivity shocks of some firms, can actually have negative impact on the economy because of some initial distortions. So whether these firms are superstars or supervillains becomes an even more quantitative question. So we are going to put this model into the data based on the novel firm level panel data set covering South Korea's manufacturing between 1970 to 2010. We call this approach as a full resolution approach in the sense that firms in the model are actual object in the data. So we have very tight connection between the economic models and the microdata object. Okay, so we have basically, I'm going to show 2 main quantitative counterfactual results. The first is about factual. Okay, so what drove this firm concentration in South Korea? About 57% are attributable to the relocation of sectors. So consumers or firms shift their production intermediate input shares or their consumptions to the more sectors that experienced larger increase in firm concentration. And this relocation of sector is especially more vibrant in the 1970s. The remaining part, 43%, are attributable to the relocation within sectors, such as faster productivity growth or greater export growth, and they're churning at the top. So basically, top entry and exit into the top 3 list. And this churning at the top is especially vibrant in the early 1970s. the top 3 list of the firms, there are a lot of entry and exit of the top 3 from the early 1970s, but after 1980s, the top 3 firms rarely changes. There is a more active and vibrant business dynamism in the 1970s. But we find more limited impact on the differential distortion. So it seems that this relocation seems to be mostly driven by productivity improvement and the export demand in our model framework. Also, we find very little impact on the aggregate markups or markdown, despite observed large increase in the firm concentration. So as a counterfactual, we are going to do counterfactual for growth accounting. So what we are going to do is that we are going to make some top 3 firms grow at the average of other firms. So basically killing their exceptional productivity or export demand growth. We find that under this counterfactual, about 50% in 2011, South Korea's real GDP could have been 15% lower, and also with 4% welfare lower. And this counterfactual result, are mostly due to productivity and export, but limited result from the distortions. We pushed this logic even further and applied this average growth to the only Samsung Electronics. So we're assuming that only Samsung Electronics experiencing the average growth at other firms. We find that Samsung Electronics alone can explain about 6.4% of 2011 South Korea's real GDP and about 1% lower welfare. I'm going to skip this part, but mostly we contribute to literature and growth accounting by using the individual level firm level data, and also we quantify the role of individual firms in long run growth. So this is, I think the next 3 slides are the most technical part, and I will try to explain as easy as possible, but if I'm going to, in the later, when I show the result, things are not going to be really technical. This is going to be small open economy. So there will be represent households supplying labor and capital. There will be continuum of sectors, but within continuum of sectors, there might be finite number of heterogeneous firms indexed by firm F. And we are going to introduce one fringe firm to explain the gap between the microdata and the observed aggregate data, and the only subset of firm export in the framework. So this is firms utilities. Firms also have still standard utility function, GHH preferences, so they maximize their consumption subject to the budget constraint. They also have the CES forms of labor composite following the Berger et al. So the labor supply curve here is upward sloping. Across sectors, within sector, household aggregate, each variety produced by each finite number of firms at the sector level, which is going to be YJH. And they're going to, and then aggregate it into the foreign good and the domestic good, and they produce the sector level output, YJ. And then we can express import and domestic shares as some functions of the price indices. So this is the most important part of in terms of the model. So firms are going to maximize their profit. So this is a domestic revenue in Korea. This is a foreign revenue. And this is the labor cost, and this is the capital cost, and this is intermediate input cost. So one thing to note is that firms are subject to the idiosyncratic distortions, so tau FJL and tau FJK. So these are what in economics we call these wedges. So it represents some potential idiosyncratic distortions, such as political connections or some lower taxes due to some government connection with the governments. For example, when this value is lower, it means that firms are subject to smaller tax rate for labor. So for some reasons, they have more favorable access to the labor input, similar for the capital. So there might be many reasons behind this idiosyncratic distortion, but you can think as the potential relationships to political connections, or some firms' effect of the lobbying, for example. They're subject to demand. This is domestic demand. This is the foreign demand. This is the DFJ, is the exogenous firm-specific foreign demand. This is their labor supply, and this is upward sloping. So they charge endogenously, they charge markups and markdown in the product and the product and labor market. subject to resource constraint. Means that this is what they produce, and among what they produce, they're going to allocate how much to sell in domestic market versus in the foreign market. So what I color red here, the labor tax or labor wedges, capital tax or capital wedges, exogenous foreign demand, and firm-specific productivity. The firms are heterogeneous along these 4 dimensions. The goal of this using this model is that by using this model framework, we can identify how much components comes from which part by using the microdata. So we are going to, using the data, we are going to infer firms of distortions, exogenous foreign demand, and productivity from the observable microdata. So this is after solving this firm's maximization problem, you can drive firm-specific prices, which will be increasing in markups, markdowns, distortions, productivity, and some input bundles. The important part of this model is that under the CS and also oligopolistic, oligosonistic structure, firms are going to charge variable markups and markdowns, which is as follows. And then, so what this, so this is the domestic markups in domestic South Korean market. What is captured is that if firm is larger, it's going to charge higher markups, so get more profit in domestic market. And also foreign competition will be also affecting firms, how much firms charge markup, which is captured by this domestic import share. So the key part of this model, the key component of this market markdown formula is that they can be written as some domestic market shares or import share, which are observable in the data. Okay, so let me just highlight 3 analytical results from this model. First, if you give me data on domestic sales share, wage bill shares, capital shares, or export share, which are very easily observable variables in the computed-like data set, we can back out productivity, labor distortions, and capital distortion or export demand. To give you more intuition about this proposition 1's result, so domestic sales share, so if my sales is much higher than you, I'll be more likely to be productive than you. That's how the model works. But the wage bill and capital share is going to also give some information about how much tax or capital tax you're subject to. Because conditional on this domestic sales share, if I'm using less labor, it means that I'm not using labor that much. So we are going to indirectly infer this as some distortions or wedges based on the model's framework. Another key result is that we can decompose change in concentration into 3 components. So continuing top 3 firms' performance, and entry and exit into the top 3 firms, and the sectoral relocation component. I'm going to talk to you later about this formula in detail. And finally, we're going to also give you analytical result that relationship between sector concentration and TFP. So even productivity shocks, the positive productivity shocks can decrease it, that increased concentration can actually have negative impact on the sector TFP, depending on some conditions. So what does this proposition highlight is that whether firms are superstars or supervillains is a quantitative question. So we are going to quantify this model based on the microdata that covers 1970 to 2011. There are about 11 manufacturing sectors with sales, employment, export, and fixed assets information. So between 1970 to 1982, they are digitized from the firm survey data. And from 1983 to 2011, they come from the KISS value. This is the typical firm balance sheet, the Korean version of the compute stat. And we also supplement our micro data set with the sectoral data between 1972 to 2011, with the 11 manufacturing sectors and 8 non-manufacturing sectors.
So Jaedo,
Yep.
I know that you guys did amazing work. I mean, digitizing from the survey data. I mean, given that we have many graduate students, both from SNU and UC San Diego, I mean, could you tell us more about this digitization effort?
Yeah, so Youngwon and I, so the KISS value, this is Korean version of the compute stat, only started in 1983. So this firm survey data comes from this the survey book published by Korean Productivity Center. And then we went to some historical archive and find that there was a data on South Korea's balance sheet variables. And also we thought it might be very interesting because this 97 is a very important period for South Korea's economic history, because this is when the industrial policy was implemented, but also the rapid growth was also happening, as in the Winsot's papers too. So the key advantage of this data set is that it has larger coverage than the KISS value. So we can construct a firm panel data set that starts from the 1970s. Thanks. I'm going to skip this part. So basically, this is one of the main results from the quantitative hour exercises. So productivity and export demand grew faster among these top 3 firms. So the blue line here is sales weighted productivity back up from our model structure. As you can see, here, this is the initial period, which is normalized to 1. So and the end of the period, it increased to 3. It means that South Korea's on average, weighted average of this productivity increased by about 200%, but 300%. And then, actually, sorry, 200%. And then this red line here, what computes is that top 3 firms average relative to the other firms average. So in the only period, top 3 firms only like barely, they had very productivity similar to the other firm level. But during this period, at the only like twice more productive, 1 time more productive. So they are about twice more productive than the remaining others average. But at the end of the sample period, they become about 10 times more productive based on this model structure. You can observe more similar patterns from the export-weighted demand shock. So the blue line on the left axis is the blue line and weighted average here. Until 1990, average of the export demand were quite constant with some volatility. But after 1990s, this export demand will increase a lot. And especially this export demand increase was mostly driven by these top 3 firms. So you can see the red line here. Initially, top 3 firms had very similar levels of foreign demand, but after 1990, they starting to have sharper experiences on this export demand growth. Okay. So
well, another clarifying question. So could you tell us how you define the top 3 based on what, and is it changing over time?
Yes. So basically, in each year, we can observe for the top 3 firms in the data, right? So microdata, we have the firm sales or export or their total sales, right? So based on total sales, we can define top 3 firms, and they're going to be changing over time because top 3 firm list is going to be changing. And also, I will show that. I'll emphasize that again in the later part.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks. Yeah, we find sharp increasing trend in firm productivity and export demand, but we find more limited evidence on some trends in this distortion for top 3 firms. So the blue line here is the standard deviation of the labor wedges. It's slightly decreasing over time. But for the top 3 firms, when compute the weighted average of top 3 firms relative to the others, there are some fluctuation here, but we don't find clear trends in these wedges for the top 3 firms. And it's similar for the capital distortions too. There are some like up and down. For example, labor wedge going down here might be consistent with South Korea industry policy that provide a lot of subsidies for the large firms, who may be prohibiting the labor union activities here. But these results remain more sensitive to the specification. But our result on the productivity and export demand was much more robust. We also compute the aggregate market power. So based on the theoretical framework, we can drive some formulas for the aggregate markups and aggregate markdown. And we can compute aggregate markup in this economy. There's an increasing trend increasing trend, but the magnitude of this increasing is really weak, less than 1%. You can also find a similar pattern for the aggregate markdowns. So we can decompose our concentration into the mainly two component, within sector component and across sector component. So within sector component means that holding the shares constant across sectors, so there might be changing in the firm concentration within sectors. Across sector component change means that consumers shift their consumption toward the factors that increasing larger concentration. So across sector component is still related to within firm component because the firm concentration increasing is going to also expand the size of the sector larger. So within sector component, between 1970 to 2011, within sector component explains about 7.2 percentage point, but the across sector component explain about the 9.5 percentage point increasing. And within sector component, productivity component was about 1.6 percentage point, an export component 1.6 percentage point, and also quite entry and exit margin play important role here. So what does entry and exit mean? So as I said, the top 3 firms list change over time depending on the data. So some firms might be small in the initial period, but if they become larger in the later period, then they will be including in the top 3 list in the later period. So this entry and exit component capture this kind of business dynamism. So this entry and exit component is very vibrant in the 70s, but remain very negligible in the later period. This is because this is a period basically a lot of large size business group firms are formed. For example, Hyundai Heavy Industries. That's the reason why this entry and exit is much larger in the 1970s. How many time do I have?
3 minutes.
3 minutes. Okay, that's perfect. So in this, now we are going to, so far the result were about the effectual. We decompose the observed data into the unobservable part using the model framework. Now let us move to the counterfactual question. So we're going to assume that what we call top 3 firms grow at the average of other firms. The question, so for example, what if like Samsung Electronics grow at the average of other firms? There will be more, that's the counterfactual question we want to ask. So the sky blue line here, this is the data, firm concentration observed in the data. So if we shut down top 3 firm shocks by giving the average growth rate, we can basically kill this increasing trend in firm concentration. But as you can see, the red line from export demand and productivity shock, they are the key drivers of this firm concentration increase. If we kill 2 productivity and export demand, so basically we can make this firm concentration flat across sample period. You also can construct the real GDP evolution. If you kill all the exceptional performance of these top 3 firms, South Korea real GDP can be actually 14% much lower than what would have been observed in the 2011. The most of the result for the real GDP were driven by this productivity improvement. This is a welfare result. As I said, consistent with this previous slide, productivity shock explains about the most of the welfare impact. So we do more interesting questions. So we push our logic further and do this counterfactual at only of changing one firm, the largest South Korean firm in the economy, Samsung Electronics. So we are going to make Samsung Electronics shocks grow with other firms, average of them. The result is that this top 3 concentration ratio, like we are going to observe 5 percentage point lower in 2011. Also, it's going to have some significant real GDP impact, decreasing about 6.4% with 1% lower welfare. So we also implement this counterfactual not only to Samsung Electronics, but also to all large firms in South Korea. So this is what we call superstar area. Like the Samsung Electronics basically contributed to the GDP, but also they contribute to the concentration. So they are positioned in this here. Also, but there are also some firms that contributed to the larger concentration, but actually decreased GDP. I'm not going to name particular firms' name, but we call these firms kind of supervillains. So to conclude, so we observed large increase in firm concentration, South Korea's growth miracle period, using the model framework. We wanted to quantify their impact on South Korea's long-term economic performance. And our conclusion so far is that since it looks like South Korea's top firms seem to be mostly superstars in terms of the economic performance, their concentration seems to be mostly driven by high productivity and export demand growth, but we don't find the obvious trend in volatile distortions, and also with limited impact on the markups. So the key broader message to economics is that concentration alone is really hard to tell how it's going to have positive or negative impact on the economic performance. We have to understand the causes and consequences of this increasing firm concentration trend. But it does not mean that, but also this concentration can have a lot of large different implications. So far, we only have answered about the aggregate impact, on average impact, but these large firms may have some distributional consequences or some political conflict as well, which is out of scope of this paper, but I think there will be another important and fruitful direction for the future research.
Okay, thank you so much, Jaedo. I mean, I really like the title of your paper, The Superstars or Supervillains. Yeah,
Thank you.
that's the discussion we had for the decades. So yeah, it's the great paper. All right, so our discussant is Professor Sera Kim. So yeah, Sera, floor is yours.
All right, let me share my screen. Can you see that? Okay. So thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to discuss this paper, and I really enjoyed reading this. So quickly summarizing the paper, the main question is about the role of top sales firms and market concentration in Korean economy. And the authors answer this question first by developing a quantitative model featuring heterogeneity in firm productivity and export demand, distortions, and oligopolistic and oligopsonistic competition. And using the firm level data from South Korea, the authors recovered the firm primitives of productivity, demand, export demand, and distortions, and further decomposed the sectoral concentration into 4 pieces: the top 3 firms' productivity, foreign demand, top firm turnover, and sectoral reallocation. And lastly, the authors quantify the contribution of top 3 firms to real GDP and aggregate welfare. And here is the summary of main findings. First, the top 3 firms have different primitives. In particular, they have a higher level and growth of TFP over time, and also faster increase in foreign demand. But they didn't exhibit any specific long-run trend in distortions. And when decomposing the sectoral concentration, first, that has been rising, but 57% of which was accounted for by the sectoral reallocation, and the rest is driven by within firm increase in top 3 firms' shares and the reallocation. And lastly, through the counterfactual exercise, by fixing the top 3 firm shock process to the average firm process, the authors find that it will reduce the market concentration and real GDP, as well as the net present value of welfare. And then this effect is mostly driven by the productivity process of top 3 firms. Also, looking at the individual firms like Samsung Electronics, these firms still can affect the macroeconomic outcomes, although they are just one individual firm. So overall, I think this paper is super interesting and extremely well written. So I really enjoyed reading this and learning a lot of insights from this read. I can see that the authors carefully use the model and data to estimate the primitives, which allow them to effectively back out the main sources of market concentration and also quantify the role of top firms in the macroeconomy. And I'd like to add a few comments, though, about the validation of the model and estimate, and about the counterfactual exercise, and about the potential role of firm entry and turnover to account for the results, and lastly, about top firms, more details about the top firms. So first, about the validation of the model and estimate. As we saw before, the model assumes a static setup with oligopolistic and oligopsonistic firms having the following maximization subject to firm production, domestic demand, foreign demand, and labor supply that they take into account. The model gives the four primitives of firm productivity, foreign demand, distortions of labor and capital inputs, which are labeled in different colors. And this can be estimated from the model's optimality conditions along with the data, which is a big advantage of this paper. And these figures show how they look like for top firms relative to other firms over the sample period. However, before we take them seriously, we first need to think through whether the model is well specified and these estimates can be validated properly. And this is because in the end, the empirical estimates all rely on how the structure of producer demand and cost is modeled, and the empirical distortion measures end up being a residual from this process. Therefore, any unmodeled demand or cost conditions may be misinterpreted as distortions, such as demand shifters, factor quality adjustment cost, or heterogeneity in factor demand and elasticities. And to see this, maybe it might be useful to investigate some correlations or relations between these measured estimates and firm level variables that we can see in the data, such as firm age, size, growth, exit, and other behaviors, to see whether these estimates are capturing what you have in mind as in the model. And maybe the above paper by Haltiwanger et al. 2019 discusses these practices in more detail as for how to validate the estimates based on this type of model. Also, looking at the correlation between distortions and fundamentals can be another useful measure to look into, given that Korea had size-dependent policy or subsidies to exporters in the past. So there could be some distortions that are correlated with the firm fundamental based on these policies. Related to that, it would be useful to have some ideas or candidates to interpret these distortions. So how should we think about these distortions estimated from this model? Can you think about like specific government interventions favoring certain firms or sectors in a certain period? And maybe if you look at the previous results showing the top firms' distortions, it had higher labor taxes in 1980s, 2000s, and less capital or more capital subsidies around the period 1990s. Maybe looking into this period and historical policy changes around that period might be useful to see whether these distortions are capturing certain policies around the period. And the other thing is about the counterfactual exercise by setting the top 3 firms' shocks to the unweighted average in the sector. And the authors find that the changes in productivity and demand shocks were impactful to decrease the market concentration, real GDP, and thus the welfare, but not so much for the distortion changes. This was somewhat surprising given that the distortion had seen some dispersion between top and non-top firms, as we saw in the previous figure over certain periods. And indeed, when these counterfactual series were generated, the shock growth was imputed using the unweighted average growth of continuous by each age band. So maybe for this, having the growth differences between top firms and other might be useful. In particular, I was wondering whether the growth of distortions vary across firms and matter much, unlike the productivity or demand shocks. And also, unlike the productivity and demand shocks of which firms may exhibit different growth patterns by firm age, I was wondering if there are any systematic patterns we can see from these proportions by firm age. This is because going back to my earlier comments, the comparison group for these distortion measures may depend on how we like to interpret them. So depending on the policies or distortions that we have in mind, the comparison group might be by different age bands or by the whole cross-sectional averages. So these things can another thing the authors may need to think. Furthermore, I was asking, how would the sample coverage affect the imputed series and implications, as the current data is highly restricted to large firms, which are having assets above 2.3 million USD. And thus, it may miss firms who are mostly small. So maybe missing these firms may impact the imputed growth and implications as well. For instance, what if we are missing small but productive firms? How these implications could be different. And another point is about the potential role of firm entry and turnover. Because the current model and analysis is missing this margin, as the total number of the oligopolistic firms is fixed in the model and there is no effective firm entry or exit going on. So what if we consider firm entry and dynamics interacting with top firm activity and concentration? How would the implications be affected with endogenous firm entry and turnover in the model? So maybe to understand this, the model can extend the firm entry and exit and do further counterfactual analysis on firm entry, exit, and reallocation. I wonder if the authors have thought about this extension. And lastly, it would be great to have further details about these top firms over time. For instance, basic summary statistics can be provided, such as firm age, size, and by continuous entrants or exiters from the status of top firms. And are they mostly from specific cohorts, given that we know that this heavy this policy around the period of late 1970s might be really impactful to generate these large firms? Or are they mostly from specific industries and so on? So understanding further details about these top firms might be useful for the reader. And also, as for defining the top firms, I wonder how the authors have dealt with the multi-industry firms or those firms having foreign affiliates. And another thing that could be added is some anecdotal examples about their growth or history, or any relevant policy accounting for their growth over time. Also, even within the top firms, there seems to be a certain degree of heterogeneity, as we saw in this figure. Some firms turned out to be superstars at the end, like Samsung Electronics. Some firms remain as supervillains, like GS Caltech. I can mention the name. And the other firms are categorized by other types. So it'll be useful to see their distributions of these primitives estimated in the data and the model, and further understand what are the sources behind their heterogeneity and distortions. Was there any role of the industrial policy that we can think about? So wrapping up quickly, this paper documents a novel fact about rising concentration in South Korea. And the authors nicely recover the firm primitives and disentangle the part attributing to the rise of concentration, and quantify the role of top firms in real GDP and welfare. And they conclude that the rise of large firms seems to be a positive phenomenon in the context of Korea. I really like this paper, and then this paper is super promising, given that it asks an important question using tractable modeling, having detailed micro-level data, and provide us with insightful results and implications. But still, there could be more things that can be discussed in the draft, such as about the validation of the model and estimates, and about the quantification analysis, how they can be affected by the way that they imputed the series, and how that can be affected by the extension with firm entry and turnover. And lastly, further details about the top firms and some summary stats may help for readers. That's all I have for the discussion today. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much, Sarah, for the very thoughtful discussion. Jaedo, is it okay for us to collect the 3 questions, and then I will give you a chance to respond to Sarah too,
Yep.
with those 3 questions. All right, so for the audience in the room, again, if you have any questions, so please leave that on the Q&A box. I see the several questions coming in, but before going there, Jungmin, I see that you have questions. Could you unmute yourself and ask the question directly to Jaedo?
Oh, actually, yes, I should have left my comments in the Q&A box, but mistakenly I left them in the chatting box. My questions are, there are 2 questions. One is, can you compare your empirical results regarding the relative importance of top firms in Korea to other countries like Japan and US and Germany? Probably beyond your paper, but do you have any idea about this international comparison? And my second question is the Samsung, and Hyundai, they are top firms, but they are not just the top firms. They belong to conglomerates, chaebols in Korea. I think that is the main feature probably of these firms. So it seems you in your paper, in your model, the benefit of the chaebols, the corporate structure, which is I think the mainly diversification, is not considered. So is there any specific reason why you omitted this major feature? In my opinion, is probably very important feature of their strength. So is there any reason? They are my 2 questions.
No, I think they're all great questions. Thanks, Jungmin, for asking that. Regarding the first one, I think maybe also Sarah or Musa might be also expertise of this kind of firm dynamics literature. But I think it looks like, depending on development stages, like countries seem to have very different dynamism in terms of the firm dynamics. For example, if you look at the United States, a lot of research shows that a lot of large growth are driven by young entrepreneur firms. But I don't think that's really true in the developing country setting, or at least Japan or South Korea, I guess, because they seem to be more driven by large-sized firms, and then especially what is known as chaebols. So I think each country, I don't know what's the source behind it, but they seem to have different sources of firm dynamics and different types of firm business dynamism. I think comparison might be super, I think, also interesting, but which is the out of this paper scope, I think once we have some firm data across different countries, I think we're very interesting another set of research questions. The second is regarding chaebol. So we decided to really not to focus on the chaebol structure, because the first is that the main reason is that once you incorporate like chaebol's group level decision, then I think the killing these top firms shocks is basically it's going to even lower our firm concentration, because they're working at the group level. So because because that's the reason why we're trying to decide not to incorporate the chaebol inside the model. But as you said, there might be some lot of productivity, for example. There might be shared knowledge within chaebol structure. There might be some other gains by performing that, or even there might be some distortion related to chaebols too. But there might be like chaebol structure. We think it's going to affect some firm primitives, the underlying sources. We were kind of agnostic how it actually forms this productivity or firm primitives. Yeah.
Okay, Steph, do you have any question?
No, I was actually going to raise the exact same issue that Jungmin did, because and maybe let me just post it as a question about the framing. I think if you're giving this paper to people who know a little bit about Korea, they're going to immediately wonder what you mean when you say firm. because you're clearly talking about firms that are members of groups, not the groups. But all of these superstar firms that you list basically emerged out of existing groups. So they reflect not only processes of reallocation across and within sectors, they also reflect reallocation of resources within the group.
I know, yeah.
So again, maybe this is a separate paper, but I think at a minimum, it's actually pretty important to defend why that parameter might not be causally significant. I mean, if I'm emerging out of a group, then there's going to be tremendous transfer of capabilities, technologies within the group that are right from the start going to affect my productivity. And probably even something like export demand, because I'm going to be piggybacking on existing networks that prior firms within the group have already developed. So again, I don't think this is really a criticism of the paper so much as it opens up this other avenue for talking about how participation in group structures may affect all of the variables that are of final interest in the paper.
Yep.
Okay, so I want to combine the STEPS question with the two other questions on the Q&A box. The Donggun Choi asked a question about the subcontractors. The Hyundai Motor as an example, so they work with the small-sized corporations as a subcontractor. He wondered how that fact is reflected in the paper. And then the next related question is from the Jaeyoung Kim. And then he had a question about the developmental state and the cohesive capitalist state model. Often when we talk about development of Korea, so we emphasize the role of the government having the direct relationship and the support, mainly again to the big business group. So I think that is also related to the STEPS, the question. And then I will also give you the chance to respond to the Sura's discussion this time. So yeah, combining these all, and then you may respond to Sura.
Yeah, I think all the comments are related to summarize all this. All this, I think, questions are related to the underlying sources of these firm primitives back out from the model. So like, for example, industrial policy, there might be some correlation between wages and the firm's future productivity growth, right? For example, if this learn by doing operate, like if I subsidize today, if I can improve firm's productivity 10 years later, then I would expect some types of negative correlation between labor distortions, labor wages, and the productivity growth in the future. So I think this Chaebol, regarding Jungmin's STEPS point, there might be some correlation of this firm's productivity back up from the model within the group, or some export demand correlation across firms within the same group. So I think really pinning down the correlation was a little bit tough in our framework, because the correlation was a little bit more sensitive to some parameters of the data. But I think those understanding industrial policies or the Chaebols might be, I think is related to the correlation of underlying the shocks, which we haven't really documented in this paper. I think they will be all interesting, important questions for the future work, or maybe potential extension of this paper. And
do you want to respond to the Sura's discussion? Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, Sura's discussion, I think it's excellent, and thanks a lot. I think regarding correlation of the industrial policy, I think they were related to Jungmin's STEPS point. And regarding entry and exit margin, I think it's also really important. So as a counterfactual question, what we do is that, okay, for the entry and exit effect to explain our result. So like, for example, we're going to do this counterfactual. We're going to kill top tier firms, and then we're going to have the same GDP or welfare level. How many entries we need? So we increase this fringe firms mass to exactly substitute those large firms' growth performance. And what we find is that for these entry firms to explain this large firms' performance, the entry should be really, really large, which we thought is a little bit implausible in terms, at least in terms of the South Korean context. So I think that was the more limited version of counterfactual regarding the entry and exit margin. And there's so many great points, so I might not remember all of them.
I mean, I want to share my view. I mean, I'm a big fan of this paper, but I view this from the growth accounting perspective. So
Mhm.
in macroeconomics, we do growth accounting to understand the one country's the growth experience. Typically, we use the labor as a whole, capital as a whole, or the productivity as a residual as a whole to understand the growth experience of the single country. But I mean, your paper provides the micro foundation. I mean, using the granular, the firm level data and talking about where the growth is actually coming from. I mean, you say that it's the top three, but it doesn't have to be the top three. I mean, you can the come up with a new category within your model, and then that is going to give us another understanding about the growth experience. I mean, please correct me if I'm wrong, but to me, it's my first
No,
time.
I
I mean,
think
seeing this, the growth accounting, using this, the very granular, the level, the micro, the data. So to me, the top three is the Korean, the growth experience specific, but this model could be applied to the US or any other countries, when you are interested in the role of the individual, the firms. I mean,
Yep.
you may need to come up with different categorizations. I mean, rather than top three, you can look at the other categories of the firms when you look
Mhm.
at the other countries. So, I mean, my question is, how do you think about this? I mean, it's my understanding, but what's your the thoughts about application of your newly developed model in other contexts? Do you guys already plan to do it? But what's your take on that?
No, we haven't. So we talk about some extension of this framework because, as you said, this framework can be applied to the almost every firm level data, and we haven't thought about the how to apply this framework to other data sources. I mean, US, for example, has also experienced increasing firm concentration, and also other developing or developed countries too. But yeah, we're keep thinking on that. If you have some good ideas, please let us know so that we can start a new project together.
All right, so the one last question I wanna bring to you from the Q&A box is the question from Young Do. The question about what's your assumption on service sector. So it wasn't clear when you talked about the GDP. Is it the manufacturing GDP or you're really talking about the
This
GDP
total
incorporating other
GDP,
sectors?
total GDP.
So then could you tell us how you inferred other sectors outside the manufacturing?
So service sectors, we only have the sector level data. I didn't explain in detail, just to make it time. But the service sector and commodity sectors, we assume they are perfectly, we assume perfect competition and perfect competition, or I think monopolistic competition, so that there's no any market power at all in those sectors. We only have sector data, so we can infer those variables from the sector level data alone. But for the quantification wise, incorporating service sector is important because they're a huge sector in South Korea. So our GDP results are for the whole economy, incorporating both commodity and the service sector.
Okay, thank you. So for remaining, say, 3 minutes, I want to ask the one question about the backstory of the paper. Again, having many students in the room. So may I ask you, so how did you team up? Because you have 4 authors in the team, and then how did you come up with this research idea, and whether your finding is consistent to your original expectation or it was very different?
I think I was lucky to be advised by an advisor who was also interested in this kind of large firms' role in the aggregate economy. And then one of his papers about the large firms' role in the macroeconomic volatility. But also, if you're growing in South Korea, we always get interested in this large firm performance. Are they good or bad? Or South Korea's growth miracle overall? How South Korea becomes so transformed into developing to develop stage, and what's the consequences? Or what are the causes of them? I was always curious about those issues. My co-author and Young also curious about those issues. He's more like growth guy. I'm more international trade guy at the time. So I thought we would be a very great team together. And also with my advisor who was also interested in this kind of large firms' role in economic performance. And the Dmitry Ruzik, who is at the INSEAD, he's also expertise in this kind of firm dynamics and mislocation literature. So we thought we would be a great team to do this research together. And there was a lot of interesting dynamics emerging from the working together. I learned a lot from my co-authors. Yep.
Okay, great. So thank you so much, Dr. Jaedo Choi and Professor Sura Kim, joining us today and then sharing the very insightful, the paper. I mean, I believe that will be heavily cited. And then Professor Sura Kim, thank you so much for your thoughtful discussion. Again, we are gonna come back in the next year in the spring with another seminar with the SNU and the UC San Diego, the joint one. Yeah, thanks a lot, everyone, for joining.
Thanks a lot.
Have a good night. Bye bye.
Good
Thank
session.
you.
Thank
Thank you
you.
very
Bye.
much.